schizophrenia. Characteristics. Schizophrenia is a mental disorder which leaves its sufferers with a split mind. Schneider suggests to make sense of schizophrenia, we should categorize the symptoms as positive and negative. Positive symptoms are those which add to our normal behavior, such as delusions and hallucinations. Hallucinations are perceptions that are unreal. Lewandowski found that 20% of schizophrenics have tactile hallucinations, which is when they believe that someone is touching their skin. Delusions are beliefs that are unreal. Two examples are delusions of persecution and delusions of grandiosity. Delusions of persecution is when they believe a person or group wants to harm, which lead to paranoid behavior. Delusions of grandiosity is when they believe they're special or superior to others, which may even lead to them taking on the role of someone like Churchill. The negative symptoms are those which inhibit our normal behavior. These include alogia, avolition, anhedonia, catatonic behavior, etc. Alogia refers to poverty of speech. Anhedonia is when they don't respond too appropriately to pleasurable experiences. However, many of the negative symptoms may be seen in people diagnosed with a mood disorder, for example depression. Biological. Dopamine hypothesis description. The initial hypothesis suggested that people with too much dopamine were schizophrenic. This was supported by J. Griffith. He induced psychosis in non-schizophrenics and found that increased dopamine lead to paranoid delusions, cold responses, etc., which are symptoms of schizophrenia. However, it was also found that drugs to reduce dopamine levels had little or no effect on schizophrenics. Therefore, a more complex hypothesis was needed. Seaman and Lee found the impact of antipsychotic drugs on D2 receptors, which are found in the limbic system. The limbic system is a variety of subcortical structures, which influence our emotions, memory formation and arousal. Nerve pathways lead from the limbic pathway to the mesolimbic and mesocortical pathways. Increased dopamine in the mesolimbic pathway lead to overstimulation, and therefore the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. However, antipsychotic drugs that reduce dopamine also reduce the positive symptoms. The mesocortical pathway is found in the frontal lobe, which governs our emotional response. Davis found that decreased dopamine in D1 receptors in the frontal lobe lead to cognitive impairment, and therefore the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Biological. Dopamine hypothesis evaluation. Support. Gottsman found that dopamine imbalances are caused by genes. He studied incidence or schizophrenia in cousins, parents, identical, non-identical twins, etc. He found that as genetic similarity increased, so did the probability of both individuals having schizophrenia. Refute. It was reported that there are 108 genetic loci associated with schizophrenia. Therefore, schizophrenia is very complex and needs to be explained by more than just abnormal dopamine genes. Support. Conventional antipsychotic drugs have traditionally worked by blocking D2 receptor sites, which have then reduced the symptoms of schizophrenia. Refute. Not all schizophrenics benefit. New drugs have been produced which block D2 and serotonin receptors, therefore this is only a partial explanation. Refute. Cause or effect? Does schizophrenia cause abnormal dopamine levels? Kopoloff and Cook used PET scans and found no difference in the dopamine activity of schizophrenics compared to non-schizophrenics. Biological. Structural abnormalities description. Ventricles produce and transport cerebrospinal spinal fluid, which provide protection, buoyancy and chemical stability to the brain and spine. Weinberger used CAT scans and found larger ventricles in schizophrenics compared to non-schizophrenics. Anderson used MRI scans and found that ventricles in schizophrenics were 20 to 50% larger. Cortical atrophy is the loss of neurons in the cerebrocortex. This widens the grooves covering the cerebrocortex. This damage is seen in 20 to 35% of people with chronic schizophrenia. Vita used CAT scans and found moderate to severe atrophy in 33% of schizophrenics. For most people without schizophrenia, their left hemisphere is larger than their right. This is the opposite in schizophrenics. The left hemisphere is responsible for language, which may explain the negative symptom of alogia. Biological. Structural abnormalities evaluation. Support. Macaulay suggested that the presence of enlarged ventricles in schizophrenics is the most reliable finding in research using brain scans. Refute. Research found by Lyon found that as the doses of antipsychotic drugs increased, the density of brain tissue decreased. Therefore, does medication cause structural abnormalities? Support. Flashman and Green confirmed the link between cortical atrophy and schizophrenia. Refute. Roy suggests that people with other disorders, such as bipolar, also have enlarged ventricles. Therefore, the way different conditions are classified needs to be reviewed. Refute. Macaulay suggests that different researchers research different patients in different ways, and this may lead to the subtle and not so subtle differences detected in structural abnormalities. Individual differences. Psychodynamic approach description. Freud suggested that fixation on the oral stage will lead to schizophrenia. Adults satisfy their oral desires through kissing, smoking, etc. However, if they face too much stress, the ego will retreat back to one of the psychosexual stages. For schizophrenics, this would be the oral stage. This is known as regression. The ego controls the id's impulses, but regressing back to a stage where there is no ego means that the id can operate completely unimpeded. This would then lead to hallucinations, and therefore, they begin to lose touch with reality. Frieda from Reichman suggested that mothers of people with schizophrenic are overprotective and controlling, but also rejecting and distant. This deprives the child of personal security and therefore leads to an individual who is vulnerable to stress. Individual differences. Psychodynamic approach evaluation. Support. Rosen suggests that schizophrenia can be treated with psychoanalytical techniques. Refute. Stroup suggested that psychoanalytical techniques may actually be more harmful than beneficial, as it requires patients to experience memories, emotions which may be distressing. Refute. Psychodynamic approach doesn't produce testable hypotheses, therefore its concepts cannot be proven. So how can we trust it to explain schizophrenia? Support. Solms used brain scans and found that the rational part of the brain is inactive during REM sleep. This supports Freud's theory of the id, ego and superego. Refute. This explanation overlooks the role of nature. Heston used adoption studies and found that 10.6% of schizophrenics had a biological mother with schizophrenia, compared to 0% whose biological mother wasn't schizophrenic. Individual differences. Cognitive approach description. Morrison found that triggers such as sleep deprivation can lead to individuals hearing voices in a maladaptive ways, hallucinations. Beck used the cognitive triad, which is usually used to explain depression, to explain schizophrenia. He suggested that their mental filters only allow negative thoughts through, which may lead to flatness of affect, anhedonia, avolition, etc. Frith suggests that attentional filters which inhibit most of the sensory information making it out of the pre-conscious are defective in schizophrenics. Therefore they are unable to select correct information. Frith also suggests that disorders of willed action can be used to explain the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Disorders of self-monitoring can be used to explain vocal hallucinations, and disorders of monitoring others' thoughts and intentions lead to delusions of persecution. Individual differences. Cognitive approach evaluation. Support. Barch used the Stroop test on schizophrenics and a control group. He found that schizophrenics were slower and made more mistakes than the control group. Therefore, suggesting that schizophrenics can't filter information as effectively. Refute. It's only able to the cognitive symptoms of schizophrenia and not others, for example issues with movement. It also doesn't explain the origin of the deficits. Support. Frith offered a causal explanation for the deficits associated with schizophrenia. He detected changes in the cerebral blood flow in the schizophrenic's brain during cognitive tasks. Refute. This explanation is reductionist. It suggests that a complex disorder can be simply explained by the functioning of brain circuits. Support. Howes and Murray introduced an integrated model of schizophrenia, which combines genes and social stressors. Increased dopamine leads to cognitive problems which lead to hallucinations, in a viscous cycle. This suggests that the cognitive explanation alone may be insufficient, but it can be used to contribute to a wider theory. Social dysfunctional families description. The double-bind theory was introduced by Bateson. He suggested that conflicting messages mean that a child is unable to respond appropriately. And because it's from their parents, they are unable to meta-communicate. Bateson said that this is only a risk factor that may lead to the manifestation of symptoms of schizophrenia, for example hallucinations. Brown found through research on 156 men with schizophrenia that relapse was strongly connected to the type of home they were discharged to. Those living with their wives or parents were more likely to relapse than those sent to live with siblings or in lodgings. This therefore suggests a relationship between expressed emotion and likelihood of relapse. Components of EE: critical comments, hostility, emotional over-involvement, warmth and positive regard. Hostility was high in EE caregivers and warmth was low in EE caregivers. Social dysfunctional families evaluation. Support. Vaughan and Leff found that 53% of schizophrenics discharged to high EE homes relapsed within 9 months compared to 12% in low EE homes. Refute. Macready and Phillips failed to find higher subsequent 6 to 12-month relapse rates among individuals with schizophrenia living in high EE homes. Therefore, EE is significant, but it's not the only factor that determines relapse. Support. Reed reviewed 46 studies of schizophrenia and found 69% of women and 59% of men with schizophrenia had a history of abuse during childhood. Refute. Lamb found that in a structured task, communication between parents and sons with schizophrenia were no more disordered than those without schizophrenia. Refute. Maybe shared genes rather than shared environment. 108 genetic loci associated with schizophrenia. Social sociocultural factors description. Faries and Dunham found greater incidence or schizophrenia in densely populated inner-city areas of Chicago, compared to less populated outskirts. Van Os also found higher incidence or schizophrenia in people born and raised in urban areas. Krabendam and Van Os suggest that there is an increase in social stress in urban areas, which may lead to schizophrenia. Faries suggested that people with schizophrenia find contact with others stressful, so withdraw. Therefore, they don't receive feedback on their behavior, which may cause them to behave strangely. Jones found through a longitudinal study that schizophrenics showed solitary play preferences between the ages of 4 to 6, and by the age of 13 they are less socially confident. Therefore, isolation begins very early. It has been found that there is a higher incidence of schizophrenia in Afro-Caribbeans. However, it cannot be genetic, as Mai did not see the same results in the Caribbean. Therefore, stress of migration may lead to schizophrenia. Harrison found an increased risk of schizophrenia in Afro-Caribbean migrants born in the UK, suggesting that social discrimination may lead to schizophrenia. Social sociocultural factors evaluation. Support. Boydell found that incidence rates or schizophrenia increased in ethnic minorities as the proportion of ethnic minorities decrease. This suggests that social isolation and experience may lead to schizophrenia. Refute. The social drift hypothesis suggests that schizophrenics demonstrate a decline in socioeconomic status and therefore move to less salubrious areas, which tend to be in the inner city. Support. Pedersen and Mortensen found that there is a decreased likelihood of someone developing schizophrenia if they move to a rural area. Refute. Mackenzie found that high levels of social capital may actually protect us from stress as the environment enables people to act effectively. Support. Van Os found that single people who lived in areas with fewer single people, there is an increased risk of them developing schizophrenia due to social isolation.